Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm very excited today to welcome Jacob Marty and Siphosami Malunga, who contributed to the first issue of our journal, the International Review on Philanthropy and Social Investment. We decided to start on these webinars mainly to dive in deeply into the articles that we published. When we launched the journal, we just did an overview, and there's been requests by readers for us to dive deeper into each of the articles. So we started with the articles that we are focusing on social investment and corporate social responsibility. We're now moving to our second series where we are going to have a presentation on gifting and philanthropy environment in contemporary Kenya, but also get a field note that looks at defending open societies in the context of COVID-19, the role of philanthropic foundations in responding to the pandemic, and the case of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. I must say that this was meant to be a field note, but the detail and the level at which it was presented is actually far more than a field note. And so we thought this would be a good opportunity for Jacob and Sipo to share the insights in their articles. So let me invite you to be interactive. Please type in your comments, post in your questions at any point in time. We want this to be as interactive as possible. We want to keep it intimate, but we also want to leave this with some insights into the state of philanthropy and the role of philanthropic foundations, especially within the context of COVID. And so, as you know, we established the journal as one of the mediums of the center to communicate the work that we are doing, but also to reach as many people as possible. And so I want to also mention that if you are as interactive as possible, we also have the possibility during this webinar to give out some physical copies of the journal to participants. And so at the end of the session, if we do have people that we think deserve to be given the journals, the team will reach out to you and will send you the copies of the journal. How we are going to do this, we are going to start with Jacob, give him an opportunity to make his presentation. I know that there's a bit of fatigue in terms of presentations on Zoom and people prefer an interactive way, but given that this is an academic paper, we would want to give the speakers an opportunity to actually present their findings, and then we can engage in a question and answer session. So Jacob, I would invite you to the presentation within 15 to 20 minutes so that we don't really end up making people lose attention. Just keep it short to the point, but bringing out some of the key issues in your article. Over to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Prof. Let me share what I have here to guide us through the conversation. Can you all see this?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, those that have had the chance to interact with the journal or looked at the journal will see the title. It's Gifting and Philanthropy Environment in Contemporary Kenya, Agency of Structural Determinants. And what I try to do in that paper is to try and ask the question or answer the question, why do we have a lot of Kenyans giving quite often? Studies done in the recent past seem to indicate that over 90% of people are giving, but also what is shaping that particular giving behavior, philanthropic behavior for that matter. And the simple answer to those two questions is that whatever happens in terms of philanthropic behavior is a product of more dimensional interactions between individual agency, experiences, and the social institutional structures. And I'll try and unpack what these mean. By way of background, what we have is that one of the things that we see about philanthropy or African philanthropy is that it is shaped, or it manifests as a reciprocal obligation, which is a dynamic that you find creating almost a never-ending cycle of giving, so to speak. So you give gifts, you receive gifts at any one point, right from maybe when you were born or even before you were born. There are gifts that are coming to you or towards you. But when we specifically look at the issue of reciprocity and obligation, this has various theorizations or conceptions. Some will argue that gifts definitely do have an element of reciprocity, which is part of the widespread norms of solidarity that we find within social collectives. This is not necessarily limited to Africa. The broader theories in philanthropy that will argue that way. But there are others that use a rational choice theory and argue that actually what's happening in gifting is there is an instrumental value of the gift to the giver. And then the way of looking at the gift is that these are altruistic acts. And that particular paradigm argues that if you're giving something with an expectation of return, then it ceases to be a gift or philanthropic for that matter. It is, that is what is in the realm of debts and credits. So just to explain a little bit about the location of reciprocity and solidarity, the literature argues that gifting is, or the embeddedness of reciprocity and obligation in gifting practices is literally what keeps this particular cycle of giving. Some literature argues that there is some positive correlations or links between giving of time and money and personal returns, such as higher happiness, self-satisfaction, and mental or physical well-being. However, other studies try to qualify that, arguing that such benefits are more likely to accrue to those whose giving practices include direct and repeated face-to-face contacts. And when you look at that particular qualification, you probably get some resonance with African gifting practices, in the sense that there is a lot of direct giving at community levels, involving mutual exchanges by people, sometimes or most often of similar socioeconomic characteristics. Remember, this is not to say that people within higher socioeconomic characteristics do not give to those in lower social classes. And there has been some theorization of that, and Wilkinson, Maposa, and Fowler a couple of years ago coined the concept of horizontal philanthropy in trying to explain that particular phenomenon. When it goes to the rational choice, the key argument is that gifts are purely utilitarian, market-based exchanges between individuals, and that the givers are motivated by an anticipation of a reward. And in a sense, that has also been used to explain the instrumental-oriented gifts of the corporate world, which try to carry favor with customers, employees, local communities, and others, while the expectation is that the companies are able to improve their bottom line, or they have some reputational benefits. And therefore, we cannot look at those particular gifts as on the basis of moral compassion. And then the other way of looking at the gift then is the altruistic, which is driven by moral compassions. The idea is that a gift should be motivated by altruism, defined as a behavior induced by considerations for the need of others, instead of the individual giver's own reward. And you find a lot of that within all religions of the world, or religious traditions, but also partly into the African philosophical worldviews, religious and philosophical worldviews, Ubuntu, Hutu, and many others in different parts of this continent. So when I move to giving, we find, I think I mentioned it a little bit, that giving is quite prevalent in Kenya. A study done by Yetu Initiative in 2018 found that 93% of Kenyans give either directly to other individuals or to charitable causes. And that 92% give informally to individuals, while 64% give to organizations. And they also argued that most of this giving is directed towards helping fellow citizens overcome challenges related to health, poverty, and economic empowerment. And on average, at least 24% of all giving was directed to each of these particular causes. They also argue that in Kenya, the gifting or giving has actually been on the rise. And when you look at that particular picture, what it does is that it paints a completely different picture from the type of literature that we've been seeing maybe about 10 or so years ago, when there wasn't that much literature on African giving. And therefore, it dispels the myth that we are not a species that gives one another, as in the Africans don't give much. The reality is it is very different. So looking at that particular context, then I try to see exactly, so what is the specific theory then that I apply in trying to understand what's happening and the motivations and the outcomes for that matter. And I apply two sociological theories. One is habitus, and then juxtapose that with Weber's rationalities, which is the four rationalities are instrumental rationality, value rationality, affectual, and traditional. And when we look at that, then we find that the sociocultural worldviews and faiths do combine with socioeconomic conditions and legal environment to symbolically coerce and shape philanthropic giving behavior. But when we, just to expound on the concept of habitus, so what is it? Bourdieu, a French sociologist, argued that, or defined it as a system of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted, to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operational necessary in order to sustain them. So when we look at that, it's definitely quite heavy in terms of trying to tell us what it is. But essentially, it is those dispositions which structure the way we behave, the way we interact with one another. That is what Bourdieu would say. When it comes to Weber, his definitions of value rationality, he says that we can see this happening or occurring when an act of giving is valued for its own sake, regardless of the possibility of successful outcomes. Affectual rationality is illustrated in feelings of emotions. And then the traditional rationality is a product of habits formed over several generations. Again, you find that particular framing having certain resonances with Bourdieu's habitus. And then instrumental rationality is practiced, or we find that in situations where actors use expectations of results as conditions and means for attaining some desired ends or some calculated ends. In terms of methodology, the study that I'm talking to today, which is published here, was qualitative, which involved reviewing existing literature, policy documents, but also in-depth interviews with at least 15 participants, aged between ages 33 to 90. All of them work in philanthropy in one way or another. The people of different faiths as represented in Kenya. And after doing that particular analysis, this is what I came up with, in the sense that I can be able to argue that gifting and philanthropy is shaped by all these specific factors. There is individual agency, there is faith and African philosophical worldviews, there is widespread socioeconomic precarity that exists. There are also social-cultural institutions, but also the legal and the political environment within which these operate. What I'm going to do now is to quickly go through some of the key findings in terms that I think do support this particular conclusion here. So what we find, the study finds that Kenyans have a brand of impulsive giving, but also institutionalized self-help and mutual aid pro-social behavior, which is characterized by reciprocity, which is motivated by both altruism, but also self-interest, rationality. And that these practices are informed by a belief that by giving, one is sowing for a future and expects to reap some benefit when it is their turn in need, or a turn of need, rather. And that's a quote directly from a participant. So we also see that giving and philanthropy is also largely shaped by widespread precarity, manifesting in high unemployment rates, epidemics, natural or man-made disasters, and low state capacity in delivering welfare services and public goods in certain parts of the country. The northern part of Kenya, for instance, we have incessant droughts, which are which have forced Kenyans or Kenyans from other parts of other regions of the country to do something about it. So in a sense, we can make a claim that socioeconomic precarity predisposes Kenyans to practice strong reciprocity as social insurance against these particular adversities. But we also find that the philanthropic impulse in these socioeconomic conditions is affectual, and it's driven by emotive desire to assist those in need. Some of the people that I talked to were very clear that you cannot, among the Maasais, for instance, you cannot have so many cattle, and cattle is the symbolism for wealth in that. You cannot have so many cattle when your brother or the next door neighbor has nothing to milk. So culturally, you give them one or two, and At some point, they will pay back, but it's not, they will pay back in other ways. There's this particular participant who argues that many people helped me in the past and I went to school. I went to the university. I do not see why I should not do the same to others. Those who helped me did not want any returns from me, save for me to do the same to others. So therefore, what you find there is a reciprocity, but that particular reciprocity is not just directed to those that have helped you. It is generalized in multiple directions. How much more time do I have, Becky?
So you have about 5 minutes to wrap up.
Okay, I'll try and do that. Some of these things have been theorized as the economy of affection by Goran Hayden. And it says that this widespread reciprocity helps people to get by despite their precarity. And it's inscribed in every language like Mutu Niwatu in Swahili, which is essentially like individuals' well-being is predicated on the well-being of the collective. I've talked about the Maasai example there already. But so what you find here is that particular horizontal type of philanthropy is also serves a boarding purpose in these societies, where the giving behavior is deeply embedded upon givers and receivers ecology and dynamics of social relationships within them. This is because most giving happens between members of the same community, congregation, or locality. And the social pressures are there, which do what Bourdieu would call symbolic coercion, to force you to, or to force one another to do that. And there is a moral conventionalist nature of this particular giving, because you find that people have loyalties to their families, to their friends, to local groups, or to local causes, so to speak. But when we go back to Bourdieu, we would argue that here we also see an element of individual agency determining which causes to support or to give to, and not, because you can't give to everyone. So there's an element where individual agency then dictates who is giving what and to who. And the more we look at agency, so agency accounts for variations in behavior of individuals sharing habitats, suggesting the subjectivity of habitats, which in turn yields different conducts in different strategic opportunities. This agentic prosocial dimension of habitats is largely ignored in the original formulation of the theory, but it is apparent, for example, in the form of those who engage only in certain forms of philanthropy due to their education, for instance, or training dispositions, a category that Sagira characterizes as moral critics. These are very highly developed these moral critics have a highly developed sense of compassion of their responsibility towards others. And we find a lot of that in the sense that previous studies, even before mine, do report how socioeconomic structuring of giving behavior extends to not just the informal, but also to formal institutions of philanthropy. One of the richest Kenyans, Manu Chandaria, that I interviewed, talked about the need that as he started his businesses and as we were growing, there was every need to be able to give because there's quite a lot that happening around. But we also see that they are also instrumentally rational gifts. And you find these, like I argued, within the corporate philanthropy programs, maybe not all of them, but these will be motivated by the need to maintain a good image in the communities where their businesses thrive. Sagira calls these moral individualists who tend to be more calculating in their charitable activities, using them to further their own ends, such as helping their career or giving to causes which they either are or might in the future be beneficiaries. Others that fall in that particular category in the Kenyan seen are politicians. They constantly have to give, but that giving is, quote unquote, an investment in votes and many others. Some say it has corrupted the nature of politics, but also the integrity of the gifts. When we look at faith, we have all major faiths represented in Kenya, and each of them says that we need to take care of those that are less fortunate, for instance. And according to Afrobarometer, about 64.2% of Kenyans belong to a specific religious group. And because of that, faith combines with the traditional effective and combines with traditional worldviews to shape the traditional, the affective, and also rational giving behavior. But faith also plays a role in the reproduction of habitats, those durable dispositions that we talked about earlier. Religion, but we have also seen that religion has been abused quite often with pastors sometimes inducing people to give. A lot of what is being given in the name of helping the poor does not necessarily end up in the poor. And you'll find a bit of that within contemporary Pentecostalism in various parts. I didn't talk to two priests, so both of them Pentecostals. So in a way, no, I actually talked to three priests, one Pentecostal, no, two Pentecostal, one Roman Catholic. So, and they felt that some within what they do push people in that particular direction. With regards to the African philosophical worldviews, the idea is I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am, summarized by a Kenyan scholar known as John Beatty in African religious philosophy. But we have also seen, I also argue that crisis, but also the political and the legal environment do shape gifting. And you see a lot of that the practices that we call gifting and philanthropy have been in a constant flux and adapting since the colonial period to the present. A paper that I did with Alan argues that, Aina, the book that Aina and Moyo edited a couple of years ago also speaks to the same. And when we look at these particular adaptations, we see that they're in sync with Bourdieu's argument that habitats tends to adjust to new fields automatically, but gets augmented through infused forms of capital or vital goods and resources needed for positions of power. When we look at the policy environment, there are several legal or acts of parliament that also do impact on giving. They may have to do with the type of organizations through which you can be able to give, but also, at least in the last 30 or so years, the most prominent one was the Non-Governmental Organizations Coordination Act. And recently, the Public Benefits Organization, it's yet to be effected because the current regime doesn't seem to be favoring it, despite the fact that they say they want to do it. But also, increasingly, philanthropy institutions are being built, either as trusts or foundations. And what these are trying to do is to try and have or track the effectiveness of the gift, but also to have something that is more channeled in a formal way that can be able to say, okay, we can be able to demonstrate the impacts of this. So we have organizations like Kenya Community Development Foundation and many others. To conclude, I argue that Kenyan philanthropy environment is characterized by generalized practices of mutual aid and reciprocity, specifically constituted by cultural mores, religious faiths, and African social and philosophical worldviews. The legal, the socioeconomic precarity, and political legal conditions, which symbolically coerce Kenyans to give to one another. I also argue that faith Religious beliefs and African philanthropic worldviews have objectively shaped this particular gifting behavior without necessarily always forcing formal rules, because you find a lot of informal giving, but at the same time, there's also the formal. This is because of the embeddedness of norms of solidarity and expectations of reciprocity in giving practices, which cement societal relationships and communities in Kenya. The result is that Kenyan giving behavior is shaped by value, affective, traditional, or even instrumental rationalities. Then informal norms and expectations abandoned in gifting behavior transcend cultural domains to also formal institutions, including corporate businesses. Then lastly, while we cannot rule out the affective and traditional rationality as motives for giving behavior, instrumental rationality seems widespread among corporate bodies. I'll leave it at that and invite comments and questions. Thank you. I know I've overrun my time, but I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, Jacob. I think for purposes of deeper engagement, it's fine that you had to take that time. And I think that what we are trying to do with this webinar, including the journal itself, is to try and understand how gifting happens in different parts of the continent. And Kenya is a very crucial component of that narrative. And so the process of building a knowledge base in Africa begins with us understanding the different ways and forms in which philanthropy and gifting expresses itself in those countries. And so the importance of this, your presentation, basically for me, is to help with academics and researchers and students, especially our doctoral students, who are focusing on developing more nuanced ways of understanding philanthropy in the continent. And I think the section that focused on the determinants of gifting is a good segue to Sipo's presentation, focusing on the role of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa in the environment in which COVID has kind of ravaged a lot of communities. And so I invite Sipo to take 20 minutes or so to talk about the role of OSISA, which is really one of the biggest grant-making institutions in the region, but it is part of a bigger initiative of the Open Society family. And the majority of us would actually follow that because, you know, there's a scholar who actually came up with this term Open Society, and some lots of writing by Karl Popper on Open Society and its discontents. So Sipo, over to you, 20 or so minutes for you to talk to us as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Peggy. And thank you, colleagues, for making the time. My presentation will be less exciting than Jacob's. And I guess I'll start from what the Open Society's focus has traditionally been, and then go into how it adapted its approach in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Open Society is known for many different things globally. Those of you who followed the Trump disastrous catastrophe and the Biden triumph would have seen in one of the protests, one of the Trump supporters railing against George Soros as having been responsible for the loss of the election by Trump. So in many instances, the Open Society, because of its founder, George Soros, is associated closely with the founder and is recognized and seen by many regimes as being a regime change organization, or an organization that seeks to dabble in politics, which is essentially if I may nuance the response, not true. But of course, the work that it does has a huge impact on politics, on the configuration of power, on voice, on civic action, on the ability of citizens to mobilize and organize themselves, and speak out and resist and propose, policies, and of course action in their own interest. So the Open Society is an unashamedly political philanthropy. As you know, many philanthropies seek to resolve the world's problems in many different ways. So the Bill Gates will try to resolve the world's problems of health, eradicate polio and TB. How do you do this? You administer doses of vaccines to millions and millions of children. So you procure the doses and you send them out all over the world, and that's it. Some philanthropies will fund science and research to solve the world's problems. Some philanthropies will fund the saving of the environment, for example. Some will seek to ensure that children access education by either building schools directly or even providing scholarships and fellowships for disadvantaged children. So there's a whole range of ways in which giving or philanthropy manifests itself around the world, and particularly in Africa. When you think of Bill Gates, you think of malaria, you think of his investments in trying to eradicate malaria, you think of, in some cases, even investments in trying, very controversial at times, in trying to provide food around the world by maybe even researching and providing easier or better seeds, the Monsanto, which is very controversial for many reasons. We can go into all that. Or you might find other philanthropies focusing on the provision of water, safe water, and some, of course, will focus on even the prevention of conflict. Now, the Open Society has been very clear in its choice and focus on the political side of giving, which is supporting the agency of citizens in the different countries to hold their governments accountable. Now, the minute you support anybody to hold anybody accountable, it becomes a political enterprise. And simply because you are dabbling in the realm of power, you are supporting one aspect or one sector or section or community to enhance their voice and their power, and you are dabbling in politics. It is easy to interpret this because the holding of governments to accountability usually is not a desired or desirable thing to many governments in our not just in our continent, but in the world. So as Open Society, we have focused largely on supporting and strengthening the voice of citizens, the voice and the power of citizens to hold government and power accountable, to push for policies that are responsive to the needs of the people, to push for democracies that are tolerant, to push for societies that cater for those that are marginalized, those that are on the margins of society, those that are not the majority, those that are not powerful, those that society generally ignores. And we have been very deliberate in our choice of partners and our choice of beneficiaries in ensuring that we target those that are on the margins of society so that they can speak and they can fight for themselves. More than anything else, so that they can demand better government, more responsive government, and more importantly, that they have the power to choose such government And therefore, at the heart and center of our work as Open Society is the promotion of democracy, the promotion of democratic, accountable, responsive governance. And one of the key elements of an open society, as we know, is that it must allow equality of all those in that society. So regardless of one's class, race, gender, and social status, non-discrimination is at the heart of promotion and the core value of an open society. So you will find that, of course, when you start to deal with non-discrimination, you are really having a conversation about human rights, the equality of human rights, the undeniability of human rights, the indivisibility of human rights, so that it does not matter whether you are a poor man or you are a poor rural woman, you are considered as having the same rights as a wealthy, white, urban male. It doesn't matter, the rights are accorded equally. That has been the agenda and the focus of open society. So what happened when COVID hit? As I've already explained, that the focus of open society is people. So we focus on supporting people because we believe that people are the central and key agents of change. But we are not going to go and drill a borehole for you in a rural village. We are going to support you to demand that the government or whoever, the local authority, the rural district council, whoever has the responsibility of drilling that borehole does it. The reason is simply this: to drill a borehole in a community is not necessarily a bad thing, because if you drill a borehole, the community will have water and you'll go away. But guess what? What happens when the borehole dries up? You must come back and drill another one. And guess what? Something else. Every few years, that community lines up in the scorching heat and the sun and elects representatives who are supposed to ensure that those communities have services. And they promise communities that there will be water, there will be schools, there will be everything that the community desires, and those communities elect those officials. And 4 years later, no borehole, no schools. Meanwhile, you have a lot of philanthropic organizations, a lot of donor agencies running around in those communities drilling boreholes. And the politicians are in the capital cities, growing big bellies, driving big cars, living in big houses. And the budgets that are supposed to go for provision of water are being diverted and used and being mismanaged. So what better way to support a community than to strengthen its ability to demand of its political actors and agents that they deliver on the commitments and the promises that they make. So that's the rationale. That's the rationale for supporting citizen agency as the primary driver of change in society and as the key determinant of how to push for and secure change. So the COVID then hits our region. And we've been carrying on supporting different organizations, different citizens, communities to demand, to push, to speak up, whether it is women in rural areas, whether it is young people who are marginalized, left out of political processes, whether it's young people who have no jobs in urban areas. We've been working closely with all those different groups on different areas, whether it is pushing for economic and social justice, or on the other hand, whether it is pushing for equal participation in political processes, or whether it is pushing for the equal application of laws and non-discriminatory application of laws to all different groups in society. And of course, whether it is really about the exclusion of minorities in society, which, as we know, is very rampant. So when COVID hit in China, we had no idea in Africa that it would come to us. it was this Chinese virus, the China virus that Trump so derogatorily calls it. We saw China fumble its way to addressing it. We saw China hide its response to COVID. We saw China keep the COVID pandemic secret and private. And we saw the COVID pandemic news trickle out that it had killed millions of people in China. Some say 20 million, some say how many millions. But of course, the bottom line is that China managed the COVID pandemic with utmost secrecy. By the time it got to the shores of Europe, the Europeans, of course, at some point then, China decided and realized that it had to be very decisive. It shut down schools, it shut down whole cities, and it literally closed everything down. The lockdown of Wuhan was the first lockdown, and it worked. By the time that happened, it was already too late. COVID was already in Europe, COVID was already in the United States. Of course, we saw a completely different response in in Europe, because Europe is laissez-faire. You cannot interfere with people's rights. You must ask them not just nicely, but very, very, very nicely to do anything, because rights are sacrosanct in some of these societies. You cannot just tell somebody to wear a mask. You cannot tell somebody to stay at home. You cannot tell somebody to shut their shop, because this is unheard of. The state does not have such powers. It has powers, but these powers are limited by long-standing traditions of rights of citizens. There are things the state can do and can't do. So what then happened was, we saw that in Italy, when the pandemic hit, the state didn't even try to stop people. Even as it talked about it, people were like, you know what, leave us alone. And the result was hundreds of thousands of people dead. So the next thing was, thousands and thousands of people dead in Italy alone. We saw the same problem in the UK. And of course, I don't even want to talk about the United States of America, where the distinction that has been achieved under the administration by Donald Trump is that a country with 1/5 of the population of the world has 20% of the deaths in the world, which is shocking, completely shocking. And this is really a mirror image of the difference in how, a complete difference in how this pandemic was handled. Now, Africa had the opportunity to watch China's response, Europe's response, and to a certain extent, because we had begun to see the response of the US, where of course, there was a huge deal of denialism. This meant that different countries in Africa had a menu to choose from. We had our friend in Burundi, Nkurunziza, deny that there was a pandemic, refused to lock down everything. And of course, the pandemic took him. We had our friend in Tanzania, Magufuli, equally denialist about it. And of course, fortunately, we don't even know the numbers because the information is controlled there. We had others who jumped onto the notion of closing down and locking down the countries as they had seen other people do in many different continents. So Africa had the benefit and the opportunity of learning from others. And it learned the best lessons, and it also learned the worst lessons. It learned the best lessons in the necessity of containing the virus, in the necessity of preventing it, in the science that was already emerging at the time, that to wash your hands, to sanitize, to prevent infection, infecting others and preventing being infected by using barriers and social distancing. That was the science that was doing the rounds at the time. And Africa picked it up very quickly and used it. It also picked up the science that said that in order to contain the virus, you need to contain people moving, because the virus moves through people. So you need to keep people in one place and stop them moving around, and that's how you contain the virus. Enter the lockdowns. So that was then, of course, a scientifically proposed solution preventative solution to addressing the virus, which Africans leapt up and took up and used. Mind you, even at that particular time, nobody was even thinking of COVID as anything but a medical crisis, a pandemic. The only thing that we feared, even as OSISA, as we were reacting to the pandemic, was we have to save lives. We understand that the fatality of this virus is not as high as Ebola, but because it is so infectious and it moves so quickly, if you then do the numbers, even if it kills 1%, 1 out of 10 people, if that is 1 million people, that is a lot of people that it will kill. And we had heard the science that it kills old people. We looked around and we said, yes, we are a youthful population, but we certainly do not want it to kill the old people that are there. And also, it wasn't even clear at what age it stopped killing. So, as OSISA, one of our fundamental and early responses was, we've got to get in and save lives. This meant that we were now in the business of drilling boreholes, because if a community is dying of thirst, you are not going to ask that community to go and demand their MP to go and drill a borehole. You might actually find yourself having to drill the borehole, even if it is not what you want to do. And in this particular case, the example is more dire because this virus was killing people. It was killing people already in thousands. So we were under no illusion that if the virus hit our continent, we would have a catastrophe. And there were many reasons, many other reasons why we were worried. We were also worried because we saw good and high caliber and quality health systems in Italy, in Europe, completely overwhelmed by COVID. And we thought to ourselves, what about our hospitals that are under trees in Africa? We don't even know what IV is. We don't have bandages in our hospitals. We don't even have paracetamol or Panadol. We don't even have hospital beds. In Italy, we used to see people lying on the hospital floors, but they all had these machines on them. They were on the ground. Some of them were in the car park of the hospital, but they had the machines. We thought in Africa, we don't even have one damn machine for a hospital. If this thing comes, we are going to be finished. So even as open society, not just OSISA, but open society in general, we quickly realized that we needed to rethink our strategy. This was something that needed us to jump in and save lives. So we were very clear about the humanitarian nature and the emergency nature of this pandemic. So our first response was the medical crisis, addressing the medical crisis by supporting the response, the medical response to the pandemic, which meant, mind you, that because we had been told, the science told us that people need to get tested. And when people are tested, they need to sanitize. People need PPE. Health workers need all this health equipment. They also need protective clothing. We looked around and we saw our hospitals without even beds. Forget oxygen, forget PPE. We looked around and saw our nurses without even, some of them, okay, they have uniforms, but they don't have the protective equipment that was required to treat people. Even people that they didn't know were COVID positive. We looked around and we saw health systems in our countries not even having the capacity to test. So we had no idea who had COVID, who didn't have. We had no idea of, no way of knowing who had COVID, because the science told us that if you test as many people as possible, you are able to isolate those that are infected, and you are able to make sure they are treated, and you're able to prevent others from getting infected. But our health systems, our testing capacities were deplorable. It was clear to us that we had to engage and intervene at that level. There was no time for us to go and mobilize populations, citizens, and communities to go to their governments and say, we demand that you go and find PPE. We demand that you go and find testing equipment, because there just wasn't time. Our governments were also unsure. They were caught unawares. They also were completely confused about what to do. So it was clear to us that we had at that point in time to work on an emergency humanitarian response. So that was the first response. Mind you, we had been working on health systems for a long time because the focus of our approaches are rights. So we looked at health as rights, as health rights. And we had been working for a long time on strengthening the ability and capacity of citizens to demand that governments provide health rights, access to health for all communities and all populations. And some of the work had included supporting citizens, movements, civil society organizations, even NGOs that work on the area of health, that track health budgets, that make sure that the money that governments set aside to buy medication actually goes to buy medication, that the money that governments set aside to pay doctors actually goes to pay doctors, and that it is not stolen or it is not diverted for other things. We had been working on strengthening the capacity of citizens to make sure that hospitals themselves provide, adequate, affordable, and effective and meaningful health services. We had been working on the governance of the health sector itself. We had been working on the quality and access to health services. We had been working on access to medicines, equitable access to medicines. We had been working on so many different things that involves the mobilization of the population, the people as the key and critical agents of change to demand that the governments and the states that have the responsibility for this pass the right laws and provide the right policies for equal access to health. That had been our focus. But at this particular moment in time, there was no time to do that. We figured that we have to continue to do that, but we need to shift the gears to something else. So a lot of the shift was around the provision and the support and the demand for a responses that were effective and meaningful by governments, because we were quite clear that ultimately the government retained the responsibility of responding to COVID. We have never ever felt that there's anybody else who has the responsibility. But we also recognize that if you don't push governments, they just won't do it. They have no incentive to do it unless citizens demand it. And citizens cannot expect donor agencies to come and fill gaps where governments are stealing the money that is supposed to provide the services. So that has been the rationale and the thinking. So
you have about 5 minutes, Sipho, to
wrap up.
Yeah.
All right, no problem. So, but we realized very quickly that the COVID pandemic provided a fantastic opportunity for so many things that we had not expected. So the first thing was that the lockdowns provided an unbelievable opportunity for authoritarian regimes to lock down countries, to stop any activity, to stop any agitation, to stop political activity, civic activity, because when people were locked down, they were told to go home, stay home, don't get out. So governments could now literally do whatever they wanted. And we saw the COVID crisis mutate from a health crisis into a democracy and human rights crisis. We saw the very rampant violations of human rights under the guise of enforcing lockdowns by police, by the army. We also saw, with the surge of resources that were coming into a COVID response, we saw that COVID became this golden goose for elites, political elites, to steal money. So we saw a surge in corruption because of COVID. We even saw in Malawi, for example, huge amounts of money given to the First Lady Mutharika, which allowed her to do whatever she wanted. We saw 60 million COVID contracts in Zimbabwe. The first family, the family of the president, being implicated in that. We saw the same in places like Uganda. Of course, we've seen the same in here in South Africa, where I am, and we've even had prosecution of people, resignations of high-level officials. So COVID became another crisis. It became a crisis in democracy, a crisis of human rights, a crisis of corruption, a crisis of violence, a crisis of conflict. And we realized that we were now required as the open society to adjust to this new crisis, which was a golden opportunity now to many of our governments to clamp down on civic space, on rights, but also a golden opportunity to start stealing money. So we made an adjustment and started to support the monitoring of the implementation of COVID lockdowns, as an example. We started to monitor very carefully the use and the allocation of COVID funds, the social protection funds that governments were claiming they were going to give to each family. We wanted to monitor, is this actually going to these families? And of course, we looked for organizations that looked at these things on budget tracking, on monitoring, on accountability to do this for us. And we discovered most shocking things, that governments were announcing programs and saying they are using algorithms to determine who qualifies for social protection. And this money was not getting anywhere near these people. So whole communities were starving because lockdown meant that people could not go and get food. It meant that, so another crisis emerged, a crisis of hunger and starvation, which was enforced by guns and the army and the police, because people were told stay indoors. So people had to make a choice. Do I die from starvation or do I die from COVID? And they made a choice that we're going to go out there and find food. And of course, waiting outside their gates were police and army to beat them up. That became a crisis which we needed to also support our citizens to respond to. Finally, one of the things that COVID did, which we never anticipated, was that when countries were locked down, literally economic activity was stopped. Now, this meant that initially we had no idea what the implications would be, but very quickly we realized that it meant that as long as the productive capacity of countries was halted, it also meant that it would have a severe economic impact on the countries. And before long, unemployment rose to record levels. Before long, companies stopped paying people. They laid off people. They sent people home, some of them. And the minute people could not earn money, people started starving. We had no idea that COVID would transform into a socio-economic crisis, which it has now. So we then had to make an adjustment. So we were adjusting at every step of the way as we were looking at how COVID was transforming and was mutating, not just the virus itself, but how it was mutating its impact on society. So we then had to adjust our programs, because we work as well on economic and social justice, because part of open society is equal access to economic opportunity, is equal access to food, to socio-economic rights, housing, the right to housing, the right to food, the right to education. And we saw COVID decimate each and every one of these socio-economic rights, which meant that we had to make an adjustment. We had to then work on programs that seek to respond to the impact of the socio-economic impact of COVID. That meant working with informal traders, vendors, who are largely women, because COVID then became a crisis. It became a gender crisis. Nobody was looking at the gender dimensions of COVID. Nobody was looking at how young girl children were affected more by the closure of schools than young boy children. Because when you began to do the science and the analysis, you could see that there was a disaggregated impact of COVID on the different sectors of the community. But at the time it came, nobody thought it would be like this. No, people just thought, let's run away, hide, and prevent people from dying. So the last point, Peggy, and I'll stop here, was that we recognize that at the end of the day, we must put people at the center of the response to COVID. Mind you, because many of our governments had generally and traditionally failed our people, which is why our health systems were in the deplorable state that they were in, our economies were in the deplorable state that they were in, we recognized that people had to be at the center of it. And it didn't require us to recognize this, because people immediately organized themselves. In many places, people realized that the government is not coming to save them. So many communities started reaching out to diaspora to mobilize money for PPE, to mobilize money for sanitizers and all these other things that were required. In many countries, you know, diaspora and local communities mobilized money to start refurbishing hospital wards for isolation, some of them infectious disease hospitals. Many communities and citizens started contributing money to buy, what do they call this? The oxygen machines, the ventilators, because they were clear that the government wasn't going to do it because the government hadn't done it even when there was no COVID. So, and the government was claiming it didn't have any money for it. Instead, it was going all over the world asking for aid, which it was then stealing at the same time. So we recognize that more than ever before, we needed an engaged citizenry. We needed a citizenry that was not only taking responsibility for addressing and responding to the COVID, but for holding the government to account more than ever, now better than ever and more than ever. So the citizen pushed back to a number of things, including demanding that government responds effectively and meaningfully to COVID became a critical element of our support. The second was citizen pushback to increased authoritarian rule and the abuse of COVID-related restrictions and the abuse of human rights became a critical element of supporting citizens to resist this, because it was the citizens that had to resist. Nobody else was going to resist for them. The third, empowering citizens to adjust to the socio-economic impact of COVID, because nobody was coming to save them. To demand that governments put in place social protection measures, governments make sure that those communities that are vulnerable actually get the support they need, that governments are held to account for the aid they receive to respond to COVID, that governments buy the medicines, that governments put the money where they are claiming they are going to put it. That required supporting citizens to push for this, not anybody else. So we were still well within our mandate of working with citizens, pushing for open society values and principles. The last point was,
I would want you to wrap up so that we can get some questions now. We really have a few minutes left now.
All right, let me waive my last point. I think I've said enough anyway. It doesn't really matter, Big. I'll waive my last point. I think I've covered many of the things.
Thanks, Sipho.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me just see. We'll come back. You can make the last point when you give your final remarks. Let me just see let me just see from the participants if there's anyone with a question. Please just feel free to just jump in. We are not so many, so it should be easy to just jump in. Okay, I don't see anyone wanting to say anything. So I think there were a couple of areas that maybe as we think about lending now, both of you might speak to. So Jacob, I know you also did carry out, some research, after you had already submitted your article on COVID and philanthropic responses, mainly in Kenya and Tanzania. And this speaks directly to some of the issues that Sipho has raised. And maybe when we get to you giving your final points, you might want to reflect on that as well. And then Sipho, I think that, a lot of philanthropic institutions like yourselves had so many shifts that they had to make as a response to COVID. And of course, you have explained in the main shifts that you made externally in terms of your programming and the issues that you had to respond to. But there were also many shifts that you had to do internally. And I think it might be useful as you close to also refer to some of those. For example, the speed at which you had to respond, did that change as a result of COVID-19, especially seeing that you're a grant-making institution? Leadership, what kind of leadership then did you have to rely on? We normally talk about liquid leadership during times of crisis and uncertainty. Is that something that happened with OSISA and OSF as a whole? Issues around collaborations and are having to collaborate with either new players or bigger players in the donor space to collectively pull your resources together. And budgeting. I mean, a lot of groups were affected by COVID-19 simply because donors had to reprioritize some of the issues that they wanted to support. And so those are some of the issues that I think as you close and making your final points, you might want to just touch on briefly. And then there's a question here that says, were responses to philanthropy in Africa driven by cultural and religious beliefs more than a Western notion of philanthropy? So, did this also change the lens in which philanthropic effectiveness was viewed? This is a question from Aska. So you might both want to touch on that as you make your final points. So let's start with you, Jacob, and then we'll get back to Sipho.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. Let me speak to the question on the chart first, and then come to what you asked me to respond to. So I don't think we can make the argument that everything is culturally driven. I think what we have is philanthropic behavior in contemporary Africa is a hybrid of both our cultures, but also the experiences that the peoples of this particular continent have gone through. It is that particular notion of the connectedness, the reciprocity that needs to be there, or how it is, how this pans out sometimes even in everyday life, that you would argue that is impacting that. Yes, culture is part of it, religion is part of it, but also currently, the law in different parts of the continent also do either incentivize, but sometimes also become bottlenecks for philanthropy. But even with restrictions, people still continue giving. I'll give an example of Kenya. There has been a lot of disquiet about the Harambee movement, which in the 70s and 80s, we see a lot happening. But towards the multi-party era, early 90s, Harambees start being quite abused. Sometimes people are stealing from the public coffers, redistributing part of it in Harambees. And so it's what the Nigerian scholar calls dual publics. We have the civic public, which is part of the state and everything else that we do in terms of a modern state. But then we also have the primordial public, we tend to, or some of the rich people or some of the people that are engaged in large-scale philanthropy or some huge money, sometimes we'll steal from the civic public and pass a bit of that to their primordial publics. So those are the opportunities, I think, that Sipho was talking about in terms of the crisis in leadership, the crisis of a lot of corruption. I think almost every part of the continent, most countries, but it's not just this continent actually. Friends in India who argue that for Modi, it became a cash cow. So there are all these things that you find in terms of that particular crisis of accountability, the crisis of governance, and for many an African dictator or people with dictatorial inclinations and their leadership, the COVID was probably a godsend opportunity. In Kenya, they're currently talking about there's something they're calling it a BBI. And BBI is meant to be Building Bridges Initiative. Some have called it Breaking Bridges. But the more you look at it, the more you realize that when COVID hit, for instance, and the lockdowns and everything else, the lockdowns were only to specific groups of people within the political spectrum, within the elites for that matter. Then, yeah, with regards to COVID, I think a lot of organizations, but also people themselves, have had, there's been a lot of agility and very quick responses. Both the standard that you're citing, Becky, we find a lot of that in the sense that even huge corporations and foundations quickly give to the Solidarity Fund or the equivalent of the same in various parts of the continent. But also, I've done other interviews in a completely different project that seems to indicate that this was quite the norm once COVID hit. In Nigeria, we see COVID also offering, to some extent, opportunities for new form of partnerships. I came across an example, for instance, where a private company, Unilever, wants to distribute, donates and wants to distribute sanitizers, PPEs, and the like. And who do they go for? They go for non-governmental organizations that think can be able to reach the type of populations that they want. And these particular organizations did not necessarily work on health or public health issues. One of them that I interviewed for that other study was an advocacy, a climate change advocacy organization. So, but that particular ability to change your focus points, but of course, I think there is an instinctual thing here. It's like this is about survival, and we need to divert resources to that level. So that is an opportunity for collaborations that probably before COVID, there might have been attempts to get different entities to collaborate, but it never happened. In Mexico, I'm told of similar cases like the Nigerian that I've just mentioned. So there has been a lot of innovations or adaptations that have happened. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Sipho, I think there are specific questions that have been posed to you on the chat. I mean, Simiso is asking, how flexible has OSISA been to its grantees with running projects on budget and activity modifications in light of COVID? And then secondly, this might be not really specific to you, but you might want to make a comment from Karaman, one of our strategic partners in North Africa. She says in some contexts, large multinationals took the pandemic as an excuse to commit major human rights violations and negotiate for unfair deals with underdeveloped and developing governments. Has this been something that has been in your radar as a civil society organization? Sipho, and then you can make the point that you did not make in the last round.
Yeah. So I think the point that I didn't make was probably covered in what I had said. So I'll answer the quick questions, Big. I'll start with yours. So what internal changes did we make? So as OSISA, you would be very interested to hear that we actually went on lockdown, if you want to call it that, before the lockdown was announced. The Open Society Foundation's trial ran a remote working protocol for the whole entire open society around the world before many governments had instituted lockdowns. And a week before there was lockdown here in South Africa, we already had all our staff working from home. We called it remote working. It was unusual, and it was new, and it was strange, and it took some adjusting to. It meant that we had to make huge adjustments to our technological capabilities. We had made investments a year before, It meant that we had to make sure every one of our staff has the ability to communicate. It meant that we had to communicate to our grantees and our partners around the region that we were now working in this way. We had to now have the capacity of managing portfolios and grants, working remotely. We're no longer meeting with each other. We had to make sure that the technology was able to serve us. We could talk, we could have video conferencing facilities, but it also meant that we had to make sure that there was internet connectivity for all our staff so that they could work as if they were in the office. So that was one internal change we made. But it also meant that we had to keep our staff safe. So we put in place a ban on travel. We say people couldn't travel, they needed permission, but it started off as international travel being banned, and then of course all the other travel got banned. This was also because it was key for us to make sure that our staff are kept safe from the pandemic. We made sure that our staff had support. We had to revisit the medical aid, whether coverage was sufficient. We had to make sure of all sorts of things that were important for our staff, because we realized that our staff range, some of them use public transport, some of them use their own transport, and we realized that there were different levels of exposure because of the circumstances of our different staff. So we had to make internal changes very quickly. In terms of leadership, it meant making key adjustments. We already, by and large, have a leadership style and culture in the organization that values individual agency of our staff. So we're not a factory. We don't expect people to come and have every decision signed off by their line manager or by me. People have delegated authority to make decisions, and it's accompanied with accountability. You make your decision, but we hold you accountable for it. So it meant that we had to make adjustments in the levels of trust. So leaders had to change, right? You don't see your staff every day. Is he even working? It's 10 o'clock. Of course, he can be in his pajamas, but that doesn't mean he's not working. I mean, I've always found, even before COVID, I used to work at home maybe 2-3 times a week, and I would be equally productive. So that meant a leadership shift in the sense of understanding how to run an organization remotely, trust, but it also meant that there now has to be self-management, self-awareness, putting the hours. But it also meant that a lot of people were really working more hours than they were before, because if you're working from home, you can work until 7, until 8. So when you start to look at it carefully, you actually realize that people are not working less, they're actually working more. The speed, we realized with COVID that we had to be quicker, because COVID was killing people right there and there. So to get PPE to people, to get testing machines, for example, we helped Swaziland establish a diagnostic center for testing. We did the same in other countries as well. But that couldn't wait. We couldn't use our old traditional grant-making processes, which, can take the time they need, because right now people were dying. We needed this testing capacity yesterday. So we made a clear, conscious decision that we're going to circumvent and streamline our processes. We're going to make things simpler and quicker. Even our board, which approves grants, also was on board in terms of turnaround. So we would, even some of the grants that boards used to have to meet to decide and review and approve grants, they were making these grants over the email. So you'd send a grant, it's called round robin. So you send a clutch of grants or even a grant and say, we need you to approve this grant in the next 24 to 48 hours. If you don't hear from you, we assume the grant is approved and we move. And of course, the board would always come back and they would sit down and they would give us their perspectives, even comments on the grant, and would improve them. So speed was critical. But as soon as COVID hit, the first thing we did was reach out to all our partners in the different countries and say to them, how is this affecting you? Tell us what we can do to help you adjust to it. So we made huge adjustments to existing grants we had with a lot of our partners on the ground. We even gave support grants for institutional adjustments. We discovered a lot of our partners, some of them didn't even have internet connectivity. So we recognize, some of them said, oh, you know what, we don't have laptops, we don't have computers, so we can't work from home. We don't have internet. So we said, okay, tell us what you need. Because what you need to work in this environment is what we want to support. So in the very beginning of the pandemic, a lot of shifts were towards helping our partners shift and adjust. And that meant giving additional grants for the shift. That meant also partners saying to us that this grant that you gave us, we are not going to be able to implement it, because the grant required us to travel around the country to do this and do awareness. We're not going to do that. We're not traveling anymore. So we need to change the purpose of this grant to X or to Y or to Z. And we said, fine, let's have that conversation. So a lot of our program managers and grant managers were in conversations with a whole lot of partners on the ground, shifting the grants, shifting them, but still making sure that the shifts were not unilateral and there was accountability, but also making sure there was a lot of top-up grants, additional support. And then of course the budgets. You will know that one of the first things OSISA did was to allocate from its own budget, reallocate the entire, about 2 million of the budget, not half, but 2 million of its budget, and reallocate it to COVID. Open Society Foundation in general did the same, and you may know the record-breaking 130 million, the 130 million COVID response of the Open Society, which was then obviously distributed around the world. So we had to make that adjustment. So we had to adjust the budgets. We had to change things that we originally planned, which couldn't happen anymore. We had to address, reallocate the money and redirect it. Flexibility of OSISA, I've already talked about it. I think, Simiso, you asked that question. Yes, we had to change. We had to streamline our processes. We had to be faster, quicker. And then there was a question about were the responses driven by Western notions? No. We built on what existed. So I'll tell you a most fascinating thing. One of the things I said earlier that education was one of the areas that were impacted by COVID. Mind you, in many countries, teachers were already agitating for a change in their conditions of service, whether it is Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi. What we found was that COVID brought in a whole new dimension of the activism of these already engaged groups. So teachers became critical to looking at how the government was responding to the COVID education crisis. Teachers became critical to pushing back on the policies of government on whether it is safe to open schools or not. Teachers became critical on looking at education infrastructure in the context of COVID. So these are teachers' unions or even parents and teachers associations and organizations that were already engaged on issues of access to education, not so much in the context of COVID, but on other things, but which then obviously became very critical in working on the COVID response. So this was really fascinating. Nothing to do with Western notions. These are active citizens already engaged in the space, pushing for accountability, but shifting their push in the context of the change in the context. The last on human rights, I can't remember what the question was. Oh yes, human rights violations by multinationals. You know, we've always worked on human rights violations by multinationals, especially in the area of mineral extraction. We had a huge program called the Southern Africa Resource Watch, which is now an independent organization. It used to be part of OSISA. It's a fantastic organization, and it looks at the governance of mineral extraction. It looks at human rights. It looks at the benefits that come to communities, because a lot of Africa's resources are stolen and taken away. So we already had this. So when we have a history of multinationals literally exploiting and devastating our societies. You know, they have cartels, they destroy the environment, they steal, they don't pay taxes. There's so much they do and they do this in collaboration with politicians and already also our local business elites. So yes, COVID provided an additional opportunity. Guess who is part and parcel of the corruption of COVID funds, of PPE, of equipment. It's multinationals, it's business entities, local, working with others, external. We realized that they were ordering these things at 20 cents in China and selling them at $15 here. So that's a human rights violation. You know, the head of WHO said it's murder to steal money for COVID. So yes, we saw that, and that was one of the areas we were working on.
Thank you, Sipho.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I just want us to land now and close this session by also recognizing a comment from Faith and Marlon. So Faith actually does raise the point that because of maybe the bastardization of the different processes in Kenya, the Harambee system, for example, government did not get enough attention, or rather did not raise enough money from individuals, precisely maybe due to the lack of trust that the public has on institutions of governance. And I think the same could be said of other countries as well. And Marlon is just paying tribute to OSISA and the OSF in general for their flexible and rapid response in supporting CSO partners right from the early onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he's raising that, you know, he is from the Southern Africa Trust, is a partner and witnesses to this flexibility. So I think that's a good story to tell. And we are hoping that other institutions, donor funding institutions, are also doing the same. So I want us to end by making the point that this conversation has been streamed live on our social media platform. And so it will be available for future reference. And so we'll aid again so that, you know, those that did not get the opportunity to participate are able to actually have a reference point to it. And then secondly, you know, one of the things that I think was raised by Sipho, but we did not get in detail around it is, you know, the different legal and administrative frameworks that governments or states actually used to make their responses. In Southern Africa, you know, a number of countries were guided by the Disaster Management Act, and others opted for what they called the state of emergency. But the behavior was more or less the same across, and yet legally the consequences and implications were very different, and they impacted on how giving ought to take place or philanthropy ought to manifest itself. So the two presentations are clearly linked in many ways. One is academic, the other is practitioner-based, but all of them describe how giving happens or happened under COVID-19 context, what instruments are in place, the motivations behind giving, and the determinants. That might include cultural, political considerations. And I think that it would be very good for us to pay attention to the value that these conversations are having in terms of the leadership shifts that happened or are likely to happen as a result of the pandemic. The political economy considerations. I think that political economy is very important when we discuss philanthropy and these manifestations. And for students who are part of this conversation, there are new areas of research that are emerging as a result of these presentations. And so I would want us to end on that note, and thank you everyone for having taken part in this. Please join me in thanking Sipho, the director of OSISA, and Jacob, who is actually an associate of the center, but also based at Sol Plaatje University, for an insightful conversation that we have had. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening, a good afternoon, and a good morning, depending on where you are. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
So much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.